The dog started on a Tuesday in April at 4:47 in the afternoon, and he did not stop until the wall came open. Every day, same spot, same time. For 7 months, Rufus stood 3 feet from a section of painted drywall in the living room of a house in Grover Falls, Ohio, and barked at nothing that any human being could find. Not a sound, not a pest, not a pipe, nothing. The vet found nothing. Pest control found nothing. And every evening at 4:47, the barking started again. The woman who lived there, Maren Calloway, would tell people later that she stopped trying to explain it after the 3rd month. She would say that by month 5, she had started to believe the house itself was trying to tell her something. She would say that by month 7, when a contractor finally cut open that wall, she understood she had been right. What was inside that wall would take her 3 weeks to fully trace. What it meant would take longer than that. Maren had bought the house in March, 6 weeks before the barking started. She had not bought it because it was beautiful. The kitchen belonged to a decade that was better forgotten. The back porch had boards that gave slightly underfoot in a way that suggested they were more suggestion than structure. The ceilings were low. The listing had described the price as reflective of motivated sellers, which was one way of putting it. She had bought it because she was 37 years old, and she had just spent a year sleeping in her sister's spare bedroom in Columbus, and she needed something that was hers. The divorce had been finalized 11 months before she found the listing. She did not like to think of herself as someone who had been undone by it, but the honest answer was that she had been, at least for a while, not by the loss of the marriage, exactly, by the loss of the version of herself she had been inside it. That particular person, the one who had known what the next 5 years would look like, had simply ceased to exist on a Thursday afternoon in a mediator's office, and what replaced her was quieter and less certain, and for a long time, unable to sleep past 5 in the morning. She had thought a house would help. She had thought a door that was only hers to open and close would help. She was right about that. She had not anticipated the other thing. She adopted Rufus 3 weeks after moving in. He came from a rescue organization called Second Chance Fosters, run out of a woman named Phyllis Hartwell's garage in the next county. Phyllis had sent a photo, shepherd mix, brindle coat, one ear fully upright, and one that folded at the tip like a page someone had marked and abandoned. 6 years old, already trained. She described him as gentle and said he had been through a lot, but that she didn't want to say more than that. She said people made up their minds about animals based on their histories before they gave them a fair chance. Maren drove to Phyllis's garage on a Saturday. Rufus crossed the floor directly to her, not bounding, not hesitant, just a steady, deliberate walk, and then he sat at her feet and looked up at her with an expression she could only describe later as patient, as though he had been waiting for her specifically and was mildly relieved she had finally appeared. She took him home that afternoon. For 6 weeks, the house on Britton Lane was exactly what she had needed it to be. She worked remotely at the kitchen table, Rufus sleeping in his morning patch of light on the living room floor. She walked him every evening through the neighborhood. She drove to the farmer's market 2 towns over on Sundays, with his head out the back window, the folded ears streaming behind him, and she found the sight of it comforting in a way she couldn't explain. She fixed the back porch boards herself with a YouTube tutorial and more stubbornness than skill. She was sleeping past 5 again. She realized one evening in late April, actually happy. That was the evening Rufus walked to the east wall and started barking. She was heating soup in the kitchen when she heard it. She came out and found him standing about 3 feet from a section of drywall between the window and the hallway door, posture rigid, front paws slightly planted, head level. Not lunging, not alarmed, insisting. That was the word she kept coming back to. The bark had a quality of insistence, as though he was not reacting to something that had startled him, but registering something that had been there for a while and that he had decided she needed to know about. She pressed her ear against the wall. Silence. She said his name. He looked at her, then looked back at the wall. She told herself it was nothing. The next evening, at the same time, it happened again. By the end of the second week, she had accepted that 447 was a fact of her life now. She started closing her laptop at 4:30, as though bracing. Rufus would walk to the wall, stand his 3 feet back, and bark for somewhere between 4 and 8 minutes. Then he would go to the kitchen, drink from his bowl, and come back to the living room as though nothing had happened. The routine was so precise it began to feel less like a behavior and more like a statement. She called Phyllis. Phyllis asked if Rufus was eating normally, if the bark seemed distressed or aggressive, if anything had changed in the house. Maren said no to all three and described the exactness of it. Same wall, same distance, same time, every single day. Phyllis was quiet for a moment. She said some dogs developed fixations around specific spaces, usually triggered by something below human sensory thresholds, and that if it continued, Maren should have a vet examine him for neurological issues. The vet found nothing. Pest control found nothing. That should have been the end of it. But what followed was not dramatic. There was no single moment of revelation, no morning where she woke up and everything made sense. It was something slower and more unsettling, the gradual narrowing of every rational explanation until only the irrational ones remained standing. It was April, then it was May, then June arrived with its heat and its long evenings, and every day at 4:47, Rufus stood at the wall. Maren tried things. She moved the furniture. She repositioned the couch so that the path to the east wall was less direct, hoping the new configuration would interrupt whatever habitual loop Rufus was running. He walked around the couch. She tried keeping him in the kitchen during the 4 o'clock hour, closing the door between them. He sat at the door and barked at that instead, and the quality of it was different, frustrated rather than intent. And she felt so guilty about it that she opened the door after 4 minutes and let him go to the wall and do what he needed to do. She tried lavender oil on the baseboard, which she had read somewhere could calm dogs. Rufus sniffed it, sneezed twice, and resumed his position. She tried sitting with him. She pulled a chair to the east wall and sat facing it herself, as though proximity might reveal whatever he was registering. She pressed her palm flat against the drywall and held it there. It was warm in summer, cool in autumn, always dry. She could feel the faint structure of it under her hand, the hollow space between the surface and the studs behind it, and she thought about all the walls she had lived beside in her life and how she had never once thought about what they contained. She started researching animal behavior in August. Not obsessively, she told herself, though the 12 browser tabs open on any given evening told a slightly different story. She read about infrasound, the low-frequency vibrations produced by certain geological formations, appliances, and building materials, which dogs could detect far below human thresholds. She read about electromagnetic sensitivity, which was more contested scientifically, but which several researchers had investigated seriously. She read about olfactory memory in dogs, how a scent absorbed into wood or drywall could persist for years, decades even, as a ghost of chemistry invisible to human senses but vivid and specific to a dog's nose. She read a paper from a university in Sweden about dogs that had detected the presence of previous owners' belongings in spaces those owners had vacated years before. The paper was dry and careful and avoided conclusions, but the data was there, running down the page in tables and figures. And what it said, without quite saying it, was that some things do not disappear just because people stop being able to perceive them. None of this answered the question of why 447. None of it answered the question of why that specific 14-inch section, and not the 6 feet of wall on either side of it. The specificity was the part that kept her awake. A dog responding to a general smell or sound might work the whole wall, might pace, might circle. Rufus did none of that. He went to one place. He stood at one height. He faced one spot with the deliberate, unwavering attention of an animal that was not confused, but that was, in some way she could not account for, pointing. She began to document it. She started keeping notes on her phone. Date, time, duration, any variations in behavior. She photographed the wall section on a Tuesday evening in August, standing where Rufus stood, trying to see whatever he saw. The paint was flat white and unmarked. The baseboard below it was ordinary. There was nothing. And yet Rufus came back to it every afternoon, steady as a clock, steady as something she did not have a word for. September came. 7 months had passed since Rufus first stood at the wall. Maren began to pay attention in a way she had not permitted herself to earlier. She noticed that the barking was always directed at the same section, not the whole wall, not the adjacent wall, but a strip of drywall, approximately 14 inches wide, running from about knee height to roughly 4 feet off the floor. She noticed that on certain days, usually days when the light was hitting the wall at a low afternoon angle, Rufus would stand closer than usual, not close enough to touch it, but closer, as though whatever he was registering had gotten stronger. She mentioned it to her neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Bernard Price, who had lived on Britton Lane for 30 years and knew most of what there was to know about the houses on the street. Bernard came over on a Saturday morning, accepted a cup of coffee, and stood in the living room studying the wall for a long time. He tapped it twice with 2 knuckles, listened, and then looked at the floor in the way of someone retrieving a memory from somewhere it had been stored without being properly labeled. He said there had been a fire. Not at this house, Maren thought at first, because Bernard's next words took a moment to arrange themselves into meaning. But then they did. He said it had been about 9 years ago. The family who had owned the house before the people who had sold it to her. He said a fire had started in the wall. Electrical, he thought, though he could not be certain, and had been contained to one section of the living room before the fire department got it under control. The family had moved out within the year. Someone had come in and repaired the damaged section of wall. He could not say who had done the work or how extensive it had been. He just remembered the fire trucks on the street, the smell that had hung in the air for days. He pointed at the east wall. Maren stood very still. She asked Bernard if he remembered the family's name. He thought for a moment and said Scarlett. He thought the husband's name had been Owen. He remembered a wife, younger, and he believed there had been a dog. Maren heard that last part and felt something shift in her chest. She asked what kind of dog. Bernard said he couldn't be sure. Some kind of shepherd, he thought, brindle-colored. He remembered it because the dog had been standing on the front lawn the night of the fire, watching, and he had wondered how the animal had gotten out. The room was very quiet. Maren looked at Rufus, who was lying in his patch of light on the living room floor, not barking, not watching the wall, simply breathing. She told herself it was a coincidence. She told herself that shepherd mixes were extremely common, that brindle coloring was not unusual, that 9 years was a long time, and that whatever Rufus knew or did not know about this house was beyond her ability to interpret. She told herself this very clearly, and then spent the rest of the day on her laptop, which she did not use for dental billing. She found the fire report through the county records database on a Sunday afternoon. It was brief and technical, and confirmed that a residential fire had occurred at 4 Britton Lane on September 14th, 9 years prior. Electrical. Contained to the first-floor living room, east wall. 1 resident hospitalized. 1 resident? She looked at the name in the report for a long time. Owen Scarlett, age 41. She sat back in her chair. Rufus was asleep on the left side of the couch, which she had recently accepted was simply his side, and his breathing was the only sound in the room. She typed Owen Scarlett into a search engine. The results took a moment to load, and then they arranged themselves in a way she had not anticipated. There was a brief obituary in the Grover Falls Courier, dated 11 months after the fire. Owen Scarlett, 42, of Grover Falls, survived by his wife, Clara. No children listed. The obituary mentioned that he had been a high school history teacher for 16 years, and that he had loved hiking and woodworking, and his dog. The obituary did not name the dog. Maren's coffee had gone cold. She did not notice. She thought about Phyllis Hartwell's words on the phone. She had said Rufus had been through a lot, but that she didn't want to say more because people made up their minds about animals based on their histories. She had said it so carefully. She had been so careful. Maren drove to Phyllis's garage on a Monday morning. Phyllis was a small woman in her late 60s with short silver hair and the particular directness of someone who had spent many years making hard decisions on behalf of animals that could not make them for themselves. She answered her door in work clothes, looked at Maren standing on her step, and said, "Come in." She made tea. She set the cups on a folding table between them and folded her hands and waited. Maren told her what she had found. Phyllis listened to all of it without interrupting. The wall, the barking at 447, Bernard Price and the fire, the obituary. She listened, and she did not look surprised, exactly, but she looked something close to relieved, in the way of a person who has been carrying a piece of information they weren't sure how to deliver. When Maren finished, there was a silence that lasted long enough to hear the dogs in the back kennels, their occasional movements, the low sound of another foster coming awake somewhere behind the garage wall. Then Phyllis said she had not lied, but she had not told the whole truth. She said Rufus had come to her through a chain of 3 foster homes over the course of about 2 years. The first home had taken him from the county shelter 8 months after Owen's death. Clara had surrendered him herself. Phyllis paused here and said those words carefully, not as a judgment, but as a fact. Clara had surrendered him herself. She said this in a way that made it clear she understood how much that decision would have cost. She said she had not known his full history when she placed him with Maren, only the most recent chapter. But a few weeks after the adoption, she had received a message from a woman named Clara Scarlett. Maren set down her cup. Phyllis said that Clara had seen the listing on the rescue network. Second Chance Fosters posted all their animals online and had recognized the dog from the photo. The way she had described it in her message, Phyllis said, was that she had not gone looking. She had simply been online one evening, the way you are sometimes when you are not sure what you are doing or why, and there was his face. She had called Phyllis and explained who Rufus had belonged to and what had happened. She had asked how he was doing. She had not asked to get him back. Maren asked why Phyllis hadn't told her. Phyllis said because Clara had asked her not to. She said Clara had been very clear about that. She had said she just needed to know that he was safe and that he had a good home. She had not wanted to complicate things or create a situation where the new owner felt responsible for someone else's grief. But she had also said one thing, very quietly, at the end of the call. She had said Owen used to come home at 4:45. Every day, for 16 years of teaching, Owen Scarlett had come home from the high school at 4:45 in the afternoon. And Rufus, for those same 16 years, had waited for him in the living room, by the east wall, where Owen always dropped his bag and his keys, every afternoon. For 16 years, 2 minutes. The commute from the school to the house was 2 minutes. Maren did not say anything for a long time. She thought about the first night she had brought Rufus home. How he had walked to her across Phyllis's garage floor with that deliberate, unhurried certainty, and sat down at her feet. She had thought it was about her. She had thought he had chosen her. She thought about the left side of the bed. Owen would have slept on the left side. She thought about all the Sunday mornings at the farmer's market, with Rufus's ears streaming out the window, and how she had found it comforting without understanding why. And she understood now that comfort does not always require explanation to be real. This is the part of the story that changes depending on who tells it. There are people who will hear it and say it is a simple matter of conditioning, that a dog trained to a schedule over 16 years will maintain that schedule even across changed circumstances, and that this is not mysterious, but is in fact one of the most documented and well understood aspects of canine behavior. Those people are not wrong. And there are people who will hear it and say something else entirely. Something that does not have a name in scientific literature, but that most people, if they are honest with themselves, have felt at least once. The sense that loyalty does not expire. That love, in whatever form it takes, leaves a mark on a place. That some forms of remembering do not require a mind to hold them. Those people are not wrong either. What Maren kept coming back to in the days after her conversation with Phyllis was something smaller than either of those frameworks. She kept coming back to the fact that Rufus had lived through something she had not known about, had carried something she could not see, and had found a way to do it with a kind of grace that she was not sure she would have managed herself. He had been passed between 3 homes in 2 years. He had lost the person around whom the entire architecture of his days had been built. And every afternoon, in whatever house he was in, at whatever latitude and longitude fate had landed him, he had walked to wherever he believed that person might return and stood there and waited. She found that she could not be dismissive of that. She found that she did not want to be. She sat with it for 3 days before she called. Dex. Maren drove back to Britton Lane and sat in her car in the driveway for longer than 11 minutes this time. She went inside and sat on the living room floor with her back against the couch, facing the east wall. Rufus walked over and lay down beside her and put his head on her knee. It was 3:30 in the afternoon. She waited. At 4:47, Rufus lifted his head and looked at the wall. He did not bark. He just looked at it with that steady, level attention, the same posture, the same stillness. His tail moved once, slowly, against the floor. Then he put his head back down on her knee. Maren stayed on the floor for a while after that. She did not cry, exactly, though her eyes were wet, and she pressed her hand against Rufus's side and felt his breathing and said nothing, because there was nothing adequate to say. She called Dex Marlowe the next day. Dex had done the back porch boards for her in May, a quiet man in his early 50s with thick forearms and a truck that always smelled faintly of sawdust. He did not ask many questions, and he did his work carefully. She liked him for both of these reasons. She called him and said she needed someone to open a section of the living room wall and tell her what was there. He asked if she suspected structural damage. She said no. He asked if she had reason to believe there was a leak. She said no. He waited. She said she had a dog that had been barking at a specific section of wall every day for 7 months, and she had reason to believe the wall had been repaired after a fire 9 years ago, and she just needed to see what was inside. Dex was quiet for a moment and then said he could come Wednesday. He came on a Wednesday morning. She showed him the section, the 14-inch strip between the window and the hallway door, running from knee height to 4 feet. He studied it, tapped it, ran his hand along it, and said he could see the seam. Someone had patched this, he said. Years ago. The texture work was decent, but not perfect. He said he could cut it open without damaging anything structural. She said, "Go ahead." Rufus sat in the doorway between the living room and the kitchen and watched. He had not barked that morning. He had been unusually still since Maren had come home from Phyllis's, as though whatever had been driving the urgency of those afternoon vigils had been replaced by something quieter and harder to name. He watched Dex work with his ears forward and his head slightly tilted, that posture of careful attention that Maren had come to associate with things he understood better than she did. Dex cut along the seam carefully with a utility knife, scored the edges, and then pulled the section back. He went very still. Maren was standing behind him. She could not see his face. She watched the set of his shoulders and the way his hands had stopped moving, and she understood that what he was looking at required a moment. He said quietly, "Give me a minute." She waited. Rufus did not move from the doorway. He reached into the cavity with both hands and worked carefully, slowly. When he stepped back, he was holding something she had not expected. It was not a box. It was not a document, a letter, or a map. It was a section of baseboard, charred along one edge, burned and then cut away from the original wall during the repair. Someone had sealed it back inside the wall instead of disposing of it. Whether that had been intentional or accidental, whether it was the result of haste or some impulse she would never be able to verify, it was there. A piece of the original burn, kept inside the repair like a scar beneath new skin, and carved into the wood in letters that were shallow but deliberate, the kind of letters made by a man with a steady hand, and something he needed to say without saying it to a person, was a single name, Rufus. Not a date, not a message, just the name. Dex set it down on the floor very gently and stepped back and looked at the wall and then at the dog who had come to stand beside Maren, and he did not say anything for a long time. Maren picked up the piece of baseboard. The burned edge was rough under her fingers, the carved letters smooth in a different way, worn at the edges by the 9 years of sealed dark. She thought about a man who had nearly died in this room, who had been pulled out and hospitalized, and who had come home eventually to a house that smelled like smoke and a wall that was white again, but not the same, who had gone back to teaching, who had come home every day at 4:45 and dropped his bag and his keys by the east wall, and whose dog had been waiting there every time without fail. She thought about Owen Scarlett carrying this piece of burned wood to what had been done to his home and pressing it into the repair, and she thought that she understood, even if she could not explain, why someone might need to do that. She thought about Clara calling Phyllis Hartwell from wherever she lived now, looking at a photo of a dog on a rescue website and needing to know that he was safe, not taking him back, just needing to know. She thought about Rufus walking across a garage floor in March and sitting down at her feet with the quiet certainty of an animal that has already decided. Dex repaired the wall that afternoon. He did a better job of it than the previous person had, and the texture was almost indistinguishable from the surrounding surface. When he was done, he cleaned up and stood in the living room and looked at the wall and then at Maren. He said he was going to ask her something, and she didn't have to answer. He asked what she was going to do with the piece of baseboard. She said she was going to keep it. He nodded like that was the right answer, picked up his tools, and went out to his truck. Maren put the baseboard on the mantel above the fireplace, the carved side facing outward. That evening, at 4:47, Rufus walked to the east wall and stood for a moment in his usual spot. Then he turned and walked back across the room and lay down at her feet. He did not bark. He never barked at the wall again after that day, and Maren never found a satisfying explanation for why the opening of it would have changed anything, because there was no logical reason it should have. The smell might account for some of it, Priya Mendez said later when Maren told her. Old smoke and old wood released into the air and then gone. The sensory trigger removed. That was one explanation. There was another one that Maren kept to herself. She kept it in the same place. She kept the baseboard on the mantel and the left side of the bed that she had stopped trying to reclaim. She kept it in the same place she kept the sound of Rufus's tail moving against the floor that afternoon, once slowly and then still. Clara Scarlett's phone number took her 3 weeks to find. She had moved to a town in western Pennsylvania, and the conversation was short and careful in the way of two people who are not sure what they owe each other, but are trying to be generous anyway. Clara asked how Rufus was. Maren said he was good. She said he had his routines and he was healthy, and she wanted Clara to know that she understood now what she had. There was a silence on the line, and then Clara said that Owen had carved that name into the wood the week after they moved back into the house. She said she had not known it was sealed inside the wall. She had assumed it had been thrown out with the rest of the debris. She said she was glad it had stayed. She asked Maren to send her a photo of the baseboard on the mantel. Maren did that evening, with Rufus sitting below it in his patch of light, looking at the camera with his one fully upright ear and his one folded one, patient and steady, the way he always looked. Clara wrote back 2 words. He knows. Dex Marlowe told the story to his wife that night at dinner. He told it the way contractors sometimes tell the stories of the things they find inside walls, with the matter-of-fact delivery of a man who has seen enough to know that houses hold things people never intended for anyone to find. His wife listened all the way to the end and then sat quietly for a moment. She asked him what he thought it meant. He said he had been trying to work that out all afternoon. He said what he kept coming back to was this: some things that are sealed away do not stop being present just because no one can see them. And some animals know where the weight is in a room, even when the room looks ordinary. He said he could not explain the timing, the 7 months, the way it had stopped, and he was not going to try. He had set down his tools that afternoon and sat on the floor of Maren Calloway's living room for a long time. And later, when she had asked him what he found in the wall, he had looked at the dog and then at her, and he had said, it wasn't what was inside. It was what had been keeping watch over it. She had not asked him what he meant by that. She already knew.